At 30,000 feet over Budapest, a B-17 Flying Fortress lost its entire nose. Not damaged, not cracked. Gone, the bombardier was gone, the navigator was gone, the bomb sight was gone, the instrument module was gone. And in the pilot's seat, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson was staring into empty sky, where the front of his bomber used to be. Cold air rushed through the aircraft. 40 degrees below zero, wind screamed through the open hole. Blood covered the flight deck. And the bomber began climbing almost straight up. The center of gravity had shifted. The controls were shattered. The aircraft was stalling. Swanson had no normal control column, no working instruments, no airspeed, no altitude, no artificial horizon. No way to fly the aircraft the way a B-17 was meant to be flown. But the bomber was still alive. Barely deep inside the fuselage, the control cables were still intact, bare steel cables. Exposed in the wind, running back to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. So the surviving crew did something no training manual had ever prepared them for. They grabbed the cables with their hands. They pulled, they released. They fought the aircraft like men holding a wounded animal by the bones. And for 10 impossible minutes, a B-17 with no nose, no cockpit, no instruments, and one dead engine kept flying. This is the story of Evald Swanson and the crew of Mispa. The bomber crew who flew a flying fortress by hand, the men who survived what engineers never designed for, and the mission over Budapest that turned a dying aircraft into one of the strangest survival stories of World War II. The mission began like many others, dangerous, cold, routine only to men who had already accepted that routine could kill them. On July 14, 1944, Swanson and his crew were flying a B-17G Flying Fortress named Mispa. They were part of the 483rd Bomb Group. Their target was Budapest rail yards, oil facilities, supply routes feeding the German war machine on the Eastern Front. The mission looked simple on paper: fly and drop the bombs, turn back, get home to Italy. But every bomber crew knew the truth. Nothing about flying a B-17 over enemy territory was simple. The aircraft was strong. It was famous for taking punishment. But it was still aluminum, fuel, cables, men, and luck. And over Budapest, the Germans had flak guns waiting, a lot of them heavy guns, accurate guns. The kind that did not need to hit an aircraft directly to destroy it. A shell could explode nearby, shrapnel could tear through wings, cut fuel lines, kill crewmen, shatter control systems. Or rip open the aircraft from the inside. The bomber formation pressed toward the target. Black bursts of flak opened around them. Each explosion looked like a dark flower in the sky. But inside those black clouds was hot metal, fast enough to slice through a man, sharp enough to tear through a flying fortress. Mispa kept going. The crew had a job to do. Inside the aircraft, each man had a role. Swanson was in the pilot's seat. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt sat beside him as co-pilot. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley was in the nose as bombardier. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson was nearby as navigator. Behind them were the flight engineer, radio operator, waist gunners, tail gunner, men spread through the bomber from nose to tail. Each man isolated, each man depending on the others. The B-17 was not one man's aircraft. It was a flying team. If one part failed, the others tried to keep the aircraft alive. If one man was hit, another man kept working. That was how bomber crews survived. If they survived, as Mispa approached the target, the flak grew heavier, shells burst above, below. Ahead, the sky itself seemed to be exploding. Shrapnel punched into the tail. Then the wings, metal fragments tore holes in the fuselage. But the bomber held formation. The bomb run required discipline. The aircraft had to stay straight, level, predictable, the worst possible way to fly through flak, but the only way to hit the target. Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of explosives fell away from the aircraft. For 1 second, Mispa lifted slightly as the weight disappeared. Then the German shell hit. An 88mm round struck the front of the aircraft. The explosion destroyed everything forward of the cockpit. The nose compartment vanished. Dudley died instantly. Henderson died instantly. The bombardier station, the navigator station, the Norden bomb site, the plexiglass nose, the forward structure gone. The blast tore through the aircraft and changed everything in a single second. Mispa was no longer a normal B-17. It was a wounded bomber with its face blown off. The missing nose changed the balance. With so much weight gone from the front, the aircraft pitched upward. Hard, the bomber began to climb. Too steep, too fast, the wings were losing lift. A stall was coming. Swanson had to push the nose down, but the normal controls were gone. The structure that carried the forward cockpit systems had been destroyed. The instrument panel was gone. The controls were damaged. The world in front of him had become a massive hole. He could see the sky through the place where men had just been sitting. Cold air slammed into him. The wind tried to tear through his body. At 30,000 feet, the temperature was far below freezing. Any exposed skin could freeze. Any loose object could be sucked forward. Any wrong movement could kill him. But Swanson stayed in his seat. He looked through the open wound in the aircraft. He used the horizon itself as his only instrument, and somehow he forced the bomber back toward level flight. No manual explained that. No training exercise prepared for it. No Boeing engineer had designed the aircraft to be flown with its nose missing. But Mispa did not fall. Not yet. Behind the cockpit, the surviving crew saw what had happened. They saw the open space where the front of the aircraft had been. They saw the cables. The control cables were still running through the fuselage. Normally, those cables were hidden inside the aircraft, protected by panels guide through pulleys, linked to the pilot's controls. But now they were exposed, steel lines shaking in the wind, running toward the tail and wings. They were the last connection between the crew and the aircraft's control surfaces. If those cables could be moved, Mispa could still be influenced, not flown normally, not controlled smoothly. But influenced, that was enough to try. Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, moved forward. Other crewmen came with him. They found the main cable runs, rudder cables, elevator cables, aileron cables. They wrapped their gloved hands around the steel. The cables were freezing cold. They cut into their palms. The wind pulled at them. The aircraft shook, but the men held on. When they pulled one cable, the bomber shifted. When they pulled another, the nose moved. Too much pull, and the aircraft overreacted. Too little, and nothing happened. They could not see exactly what Swanson saw. He could not clearly tell them what he needed. The intercom was damaged. The wind noise was almost unbearable, so the crew had to learn by feel. Pull, watch the aircraft respond. Again, hold steady, correct, survive. This was not flying. This was a crew wrestling a broken bomber through the sky. Then another shell hit. At 9:44 in the morning, a second 88mm round struck engine number 2. The engine exploded in oil, fire, and metal. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then seized. Mispa had lost one of its 4 engines. Now the bomber had no nose, no normal cockpit, no working instruments, exposed control cables, and only 3 engines. The drag was enormous. The missing nose acted like a giant open wound in the airflow. The dead engine added more drag. The bomber began falling behind the formation. That was dangerous. A B-17 formation protected itself with overlapping guns. Each bomber covered the others. A lone bomber had far less protection. If German fighters saw Mispa separated from the group, they could finish it. But the formation could not wait. The other bombers had their own damaged aircraft, their own wounded men, their own fuel limits, their own survival problems. So Mispa fell back. 1 mile, then 2, the dark shapes of the formation moved farther away. Swanson watched them go. There was nothing he could do. He kept the bomber heading southwest. That was the only plan now, southwest. Out of Hungary, toward Yugoslavia, toward the Adriatic, toward Italy, toward home maybe. Because without instruments, without a navigator, and without the nose of the aircraft, everything was guesswork. Still, the crew kept pulling. The cables stayed in their hands. The 3 engines kept running, and Mispa kept flying. The men pulling the cables were doing impossible work. Their hands cramped. Their gloves were being cut by steel. The cold bit through their fingers. The wind inside the aircraft made every movement harder. Each man had to hold pressure without knowing exactly how much was enough. They had to coordinate without words. One man pulled, another corrected, another watched the aircraft's attitude. If the wings dropped, they adjusted. If the nose rose, they pulled differently. If the aircraft yawed, they fought it. They were not using a cockpit anymore. They were using muscle, instinct, and trust. Swanson still had the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That gave him some control over power. He could reduce power on one side, increase power on another, use engine thrust to help turn or stabilize the aircraft. But engines alone could not save them. Without the men on the cables, Mispa would roll, stall, or dive. So the crew became the control system. Their hands replaced the missing cockpit. Their bodies became the link between pilot and aircraft. That is what made the situation so incredible. A B-17 was a complex machine. But now, survival depended on men pulling raw steel by hand at high altitude while the bomber fell apart around them. And they were doing it. For minute after minute, they kept the aircraft alive. Then the crew noticed something in the rear of the aircraft. The tail section was flexing. That was terrifying. The B-17 could survive many kinds of damage. But it could not survive losing the tail. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers gave the aircraft directional and pitch stability. If the tail broke off, the bomber would enter an uncontrollable spin. There would be no time, no recovery, no second chance. The explosion in the nose had shocked the entire airframe. Flak damage may have weakened structural members. The aircraft was under stress from the missing nose, dead engine, and rough control inputs. Now the tail was moving in ways it should not move. The men understood the truth. Mispa might break apart at any moment. Swanson could not leave his seat to inspect it. He could barely turn his head. The wind pressure through the missing nose made movement dangerous. If he unbuckled too soon, the open airflow could pull him forward. If he left the throttles, the bomber might become uncontrollable. If he ordered the crew to stay, they might all die when the tail failed. But if the crew bailed out while the bomber was still barely stable, they had a chance. They would probably be captured. But capture was better than dying in a spinning aircraft. The decision was brutal. Stay and maybe keep flying. Jump and maybe live. But Mispa was already dying. Everyone could feel it. The surviving crew began to evacuate. One by one, men moved toward the waist positions. They clipped on parachutes, chalk-dead harnesses, and jumped into the freezing sky over Yugoslavia. Each time a crewman left, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands remained on the cables. The bomber wallowed. The wings dipped, the nose rose, then dropped. Swanson adjusted the throttles, trying to compensate. The remaining men pulled what cables they could. But it was getting worse. Every jump saved a life. And every jump made the aircraft less controllable. That was the terrible trade. Swanson stayed at the controls. Burnt stayed in the co-pilot's seat. The other men continued jumping. The tail gunner crawled forward from the rear. He saw empty positions, saw exposed cables, saw the torn open aircraft. Then he clipped on his parachute and went out. More men followed. Parachutes opened below, white canopies drifting over occupied territory. Those men were not safe. German forces controlled the area. Patrols would search for them. Most would be captured within hours. But they were alive. And as long as Swanson could keep Mispa flying a little longer, they would land farther from the eventual crash site. That distance mattered. It could help them avoid being found together. It could give them minutes or hours, maybe even a chance at escape. So Swanson stayed. Soon, only a few men remained. Then only Swanson and Burnt. The co-pilot had no real controls. His instruments were gone. His control column was useless. There was nothing more he could do from that seat. Swanson looked at him. No words were needed. The wind would have swallowed any words anyway. Burnt had to go. He unbuckled, moved carefully toward the rear, looked back one last time. Swanson was still in place, hands on the throttles, eyes forward, alone with the dying aircraft. Then Burnt jumped. Now Swanson was the only man left aboard Mispa, one pilot. 3 engines, no nose, no instruments, no crew, no real controls. A 65,000-pound bomber descending through the sky. For a moment, he stayed, not because he thought he could land it. That was impossible. Not because he thought the aircraft would make it home. It would not. He stayed to give the crew more time. Every extra minute in the air carried the bomber farther from the men under parachutes. Every extra mile created distance between the crash site and the crew. German search teams would go toward the smoke, toward the wreckage. If the crew landed far enough away, they might have a better chance. So Swanson kept the engines running, kept the aircraft pointed as steadily as he could, and waited. 2 more minutes. That was his decision. 2 minutes for the crew, then he would jump. At around 10 in the morning, Swanson released the throttles. He unbuckled his harness. The moment he moved, the bomber began to change. Without his hands on the throttles, without the crew pulling cables, Mispa started rolling. The nose dipped. The aircraft began to accelerate. He had only seconds before movement inside the bomber became impossible. Swanson stood against the wind. The open nose pulled air through the aircraft with violent force. He moved toward the rear, through the damaged flight deck, through the crawlway, toward the waist position. The aircraft was now entering a steeper dive. The floor vibrated under his boots. The loose cables moved in the wind. There was nobody left to pull them. Nobody left to correct the attitude. The bomber was no longer being flown. It was falling. Swanson reached the waist area. He grabbed his parachute pack, clipped it to his harness. The aircraft dropped faster. The sound of the engines rose. He braced himself against the fuselage, found the opening, looked down at the Yugoslav countryside, far below, then jumped. The slipstream hit him like a wall. The aircraft flashed away. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute opened hard. For the first time in many minutes, the noise faded. The roar of the dying B-17 moved away below him. Swanson looked down. Mispa was still falling. Then the tail finally separated. The bomber pitched down and disappeared toward the trees. Seconds later, black smoke rose from the impact site. Nothing could have survived that crash. If Swanson had waited a little longer, he would have died with the aircraft. The parachute carried him down over occupied Yugoslavia. The land below was a mix of farms, trees, and small villages. Somewhere nearby, his crew was descending too. Somewhere below, German soldiers were already looking up. The landing was rough. Swanson tried to steer toward an open field, but parachutes of that era were not precise. He drifted toward trees. Branches hit first. The canopy caught. His body slammed through the limbs. Then his left side struck hard. Pain exploded through his leg. The bone broke. He ended up tangled in parachute lines above the ground, unable to climb down, unable to run, unable to hide. German soldiers arrived within minutes. They had seen the parachutes. They had heard the crash. They knew American airmen were falling in the area. Swanson could do nothing. The soldiers cut him down. A German medic examined him. His leg was broken. There were deep cuts from the trees. He needed treatment. The medic splinted the leg with wood and cloth, gave him morphine, bandaged the wounds. Then Swanson was taken away. He was now a prisoner of war. Over the next few days, the rest of the surviving crew was captured too. One by one, they were brought in, alive, burnt, Gmenzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly. Tucker, Hish, the others who had jumped, most had only minor injuries. They had survived the impossible, but 2 men had not. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson had died when the nose vanished over Budapest. The survivors carried that truth with them. The crew was sent into the prisoner of war system. Life in captivity was harsh. Cold barracks, limited food, long days, uncertainty. Red Cross parcels came irregularly. Medical care was limited. Swanson's broken leg healed slowly. For a time, he used crutches. Later, he walked the camp perimeter to rebuild strength. The men waited for the war to end. They talked about the mission, about the flak, about the missing nose, about the cables, about the 10 minutes when they had flown a B-17 by hand. They remembered Dudley and Henderson. They remembered the moment the nose disappeared. They remembered the wind, the cold, the exposed steel, the fear that the tail would break off. And they understood something. They should not have survived, yet they had. Not because the aircraft was still flyable in any normal sense, but because the crew worked together. Because no man panicked at the critical moment. Because Swanson stayed long enough to give the others a chance. Because several men grabbed cables and turned themselves into the control system of a dying bomber. That kind of survival is hard to explain. It was not luck alone. It was skill, discipline, teamwork, and the refusal to give up while one option still existed. As the war neared its end, German camps began to move prisoners west. The situation grew worse. Food became scarce. The guards became nervous. The Third Reich was collapsing. Prisoners were marched through Germany as Allied armies closed in. Some men died during those marches. Others escaped in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together as much as they could. Then, on April 30th, 1945, American forces reached them. They were free. 9 months after the mission over Budapest, the surviving men of Mispa were no longer prisoners. They were processed, fed chicht by doctors, moved from collection points to airfields. Then eventually back home, 8 men had survived the flight. 8 men had pulled cables, jumped from a dying aircraft, endured captivity, and lived to tell the story. Swanson returned to civilian life. He married, raised a family. Worked quietly. Like many veterans, he did not spend his life telling the story again and again. When asked, he often framed it as luck. The crew had been lucky. He had been lucky. But Dudley and Henderson had not been lucky. That was the weight survivors carried. A miracle for one man could still be a tragedy for another. Swanson understood that. The survivors stayed connected. They attended reunions. They remembered the aircraft. They remembered the men who did not return. And they remembered the strangest 10 minutes of their lives. The story of Mispa is not just about a damaged bomber. It is about what human beings do when machines fail. A B-17 was an engineering achievement, a strong aircraft, a famous aircraft. A machine built to absorb punishment. But on July 14, 1944, engineering reached its limit. The nose was gone, the instruments were gone, the controls were gone, one engine was gone. The tail was failing. At that point, the aircraft should have been lost. The crew should have had no chance. But the men aboard Mispa found one, not a clean solution, not a safe solution. A desperate one. Bare cables, human hands, throttle adjustments. A pilot using the horizon through a hole in the aircraft. That was all they had, and somehow, for long enough, it worked. They turned survival into a group effort. They held a flying fortress together with muscle and nerve. They bought time. They saved lives. Most people know the B-17 as the flying fortress. They know its shape, its guns, its reputation. But few stories show the bond between crew and machine more clearly than this one. A bomber with no nose should not have kept flying. But Mispa did, because the men inside refused to let it fall until everyone had a chance. Evald Swanson lived a long life after the war. The crew members scattered across America. Some spoke about the mission, some rarely did. But the memory stayed with them. The sound of the wind, the sight of open sky where the nose should have been, the feel of steel cables cutting into gloves. The moment each man jumped, the smoke from the crash, the names of Dudley and Henderson, those things did not disappear. They became part of the men who survived. That is why this story deserves to be remembered. Because history is not only made by the aircraft that complete perfect missions, it is also made by the aircraft that should have fallen apart but did not fall fast enough. It is made by crews who keep working when the cockpit is gone, by pilots who stay in dying aircraft so others can escape, by men who pull cables with frozen hands because that is the only control system left. Mispa did not make it home, but her crew did, most of them, and because they survived, the story survived too. If Evald Swanson and the crew of Mispa deserve to be remembered, hit the like button. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories, because some heroes do not win by destroying the enemy. Some win by holding a dying aircraft together for just a few more minutes. And sometimes, a few more minutes is everything.